Yes. Thank you very much for being invited to have this keynote speech here. And Elias was making the very challenging title for me. So what I will go through is what is the situation when it comes to biomass in the world, and what is it used for today, and what are the potentials. And if I'm fulfilling the next industrial revolution, we will see, but perhaps in between, yes. So now we see here. The first thing is just to look about biomass statistics. When I was starting working for ASEA with the A in ABB in 1975, biomass was considered not being existing. So if you look at statistics and for energy use in the world, that was 0 on biomass. Around 1986, it started getting acknowledged that biomass actually exists. And I think it was, among others, Sweden who were pushing quite a lot to get it into the United Nations statistics here. And from around 1986, it was suddenly 13% of the primary energy that was utilized. And I guess this is the reason why you're having those figures that are very vague and so on, is that biomass wasn't traded very much. So what is not traded is not existing. So this figure 13%, of course, is just like guesstimate in some way. And you still have 13% today, but the total primary energy has increased by a factor of like 40% since then. So this is just a bit background. If we look at the world as such, we can see that according to World Bank, the United Nations statistics, we had 7 billion people roughly. I think it's quite interesting that they had a very exact figure here. Of these, 53% are now living in cities and urban areas. And 2011 was a big transfer when we were going from below 50% to above 50%, and now we have 53% living in urban areas. And the trend is very strong. What we can see is that in low-income countries, we still have around 29%. In middle-income countries, I come back to what is low and middle and high-income countries just within a few slides here. But middle-income is at the average 50%, and in high-income countries, we're more than 80% today that are living in urban areas, which is a challenge when it comes to this with the biomass and so on. These are, if you take the countries that are belonging to or measured by United Nations, is actually 213 countries. And if I was going to mention this, I would perhaps get 160 or something like that. So there's a lot of countries we really don't know, I guess. But what you can see is low-income countries. Most of those that are low-income countries are from Africa, south of Sahara. And what you can see is the majority of those, it's only one of those countries from below Sahara Africa that is a high-income country, and that is South Africa. So we have a very big difference between the different regions of the world, you could say. If you see middle-income countries, relatively well distributed, and high-income countries, of course, the European and Central Asia is the strongest in this field. East Asia, where you have like China, is still considered being middle income. We have in Latin America, you have companies like Brazil, considered being high income, and South Asia. India still considered being middle income. Sub-Saharan, we said, Middle East and North Africa. Somewhere between North America, all three, Mexico, Canada and US, considered being high income. If we then look at the population, we can see that from 1962 to 2012, everyone is increasing except for perhaps Russia, that is more stable. If we then look at how is the population growth, we can see that it's been a tremendous reduction on this during these, is it 50 years, 60 years? And we can see the only one who are not being reducing significantly is North Africa and Middle East, where it's still around 2% growth, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have more than 3% or around 3%, and it's not reducing. So we can see where all the others primarily have increased their wealth, and they have also reduced their the growth rate of the population. We then look at some key figures. We can see here to the left. I'm not sure if... Yeah. We can see here 1970 and 2009 cereal yield. Now when we talk about cereal yield, we're only measuring the grain, the thing we eat. But if we recognize that there's a lot of other things in the crops, we have straw and we have things like that, which is at least the same amount. It's normally more. And what we can see is at 1970 we had 1,300, and now it's around 2,000. That with 1,500, 3,200, 2008, 5,500. But if you look here, you can see that we have the same or higher rate on low income than we had at middle income in 1970. We have higher at middle income than we had at high income there. So we can see the trend is driving, and these figures we could probably expect would be worldwide when we come to some kind of a steady state, which means that we will increase the production dramatically. So if we can also reduce the growth rate in the same way, it should be quite feasible to use the biomass in a good way. I think this figure is quite interesting when it looks electricity consumption, kilowatt hours per capita. We have in low-income countries around 200 kilowatt hours. That is like watching TV for a year. It's very little. In middle income, significantly more, and high income, we have a lot. And what we can say is we have a very strong relation between electricity utilization and economy. Here's the gross national income, where we have around $450 US per capita for low income, 3,000 for middle income, and 30,000 for high income. So we can see this relation there, and there is very strong. If we then go and look at how are the resources distributed among populations, we can also see here, oops, sorry, this one what was. We have low-income countries. These are how many hectares do we have per capita for agriculture. And we can see low income 2, middle income 1.5, 2, high income 3. It's relatively the same amount of area that we have for the different groups. And if we look at agriculture land, the percentage is exactly the same. Forestry, almost the same. So what we see is that when it comes to resources, these type of biomass resources, they are quite well distributed between different populations. We then look at the global biomass production. Depending on how you're calculating, I would say that we have agriculture including straws in this region. I would think it's more in this region than this region, but at least this amount we're producing from agriculture and forestry in this region. And then we add them together, and then we compare to how much do we use in the world globally primary energy. There are actually more biomass resources available than the total use of energy. And then you remember this figure that it was considered 0 in 1980. Now today it's considered being 13% of minor importance, but in reality it is more than the total use of all coal, all oil, all natural gas, all these 80% in the official statistics. But of course the biomass is for free in very many ways, so you don't count it. This is just to show a figure. Some of you have heard about Hans Rosling. He's a professor in Sweden, has been following and doing statistics. So Bill Gates is very much in favor of him and his presentations. And he has been doing, together with his son and his wife in Google, different maps where you're taking those statistic data I've been referring to earlier and put them into a graphical, very nice user interface. So you can collect data, and here you can see income per person and electricity consumption per person. And here we have Eurasia, we have East Asia, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Americas, different colors. So we can see here this is United States, and This is China and this is India. So the size is the population in this case here, and the color is YR. And then this is 1975, and then we look at 2005. We go back and take a look again, and then you see everyone has been moving upwards, almost. But what we see is this. Here is almost only the country south of Sahara. Those are lagging behind a lot, of course, due to a lot of conflicts and different type of problems. In Asia, we had the same situation if we go back to 1962. But Asia has succeeded to get political consistency and driving forces and so on, but they haven't really succeeded yet here. But a lot of promising things are happening, so we hope that this will also... But it's just showing that things are going in the right direction. And conclusion, we can see that natural resources are relatively equally distributed between the rich and poor countries at high level, with principally enough biomass to cover all the needs we have with respect to energy and food and materials and all those type of things. Because what we are using as food is becoming manure and things like that. What we are using as waste from the crops we can use for biorefineries and things like that. And what we're using for like books and furniture and so on, we can use as energy source or some other source. So what we can also see is that the difference in wealth between countries, except for them perhaps sub-Saharan Africa, but for the rest we don't see a big difference when it comes to this wealth between the countries. It's much more within the countries. If you look at India, you have 200 to 300 million with a high income population. We have in China the same thing. So we have seen a change. So most of the differences within the countries and not between the countries, which is a dramatically change for good and bad in the situation we've had earlier. And the wealth is very much correlated to the use of energy, especially electricity. So then we can go into looking at agriculture and arable land. How much do we have? Yes, it's a huge amount globally. And we can see how do we use this. And we have one of our PhD students here. He's been looking a lot on production of cows and milk and things like that. And he's been doing some estimates that if we can increase milk production in an efficient way to get the best practice we have in Northern Europe, for instance, and have it more generally, we could release a lot of food land or arable land here to be used for other purposes than breeding animals. So we will increase efficiency, and in that way we're also increasing the available area for doing other things. We can see that there are significant amounts of area for growth and so on. Then we can look at different type of pathways for the photosynthesis. I don't know how many of you have heard about this with the C3 and C4 crops, but the C3 crops is you're having primarily a 3-carbon organic acid in the metabolism. And this is 3-phosphoglyceric acid. And this type of thing is most of the crops are belonging to this type of system. But those are producing a lot of like sugarcane, potato, a number of these crops, tomato and so on. They are having another system called the C4 system, where you have 4-carbon organic acids with malate and aspartate here. And the difference is that if you take this, they can utilize sun very efficiently, and they can utilize CO2 very efficiently. So they have a growth rate that is perhaps 3, 4, 5 times higher than you have with this type of crops. So by transferring and utilizing these type of crops much more intensely, you can also increase. And those guys, if you increase the CO2 rate, concentration, the growth rate is increasing. These ones, the opposite. If you increase in the CO2 rate, they are actually decreasing, becomes like a toxic. So it's quite interesting to see when we increase in the CO2 levels and so on in the atmosphere, that these are favored very much in relation to those. And these are also the fast-growing crops, which might balance and taking up the CO2. So perhaps we have a natural mechanism for that. We'll see. There is also another type of system that's called the CAM system, which is even taking a step further than the C4, but it's not so many of those. But we have like agave, we have pineapple, and some other ones that are able to utilize even further. They can use the CO2 and the light and store in between and so on. So if we then go and look at a number of crops and important ones, I start with soybean here because soybean has a very high concentration of a protein, 40% roughly. And it's also very good from a food perspective, as we have 8 of these amino acids that are essential for the human here. So it's a very high quality as well. And we have huge productions. And if we distribute what we have produced or did produce in 2009 to all humans, it will be 100 grams of protein per day, which is more than the what you call it, nutritionists are saying we need. We don't need that much. So principally we have a protein source that is enough with what we already are producing. But in reality, only 10% of the soy is used as direct food for humans. Most of it is used for cattle. We have 18.6 billion chicken and hen, 1.4 billion cows, bulls, and 940 million pigs worldwide. And this is a very strong food for them. So it's always this balance. How do we have it? Of course, we should have these also, because these are good, but perhaps you could use other things for these. And but of course, we have been looking at our tests here. We want to have this manure because it's a good balance also for the production of different chemicals in the above project. If we look at rice, it's a crop for tropical and subtropical countries, and average production is around 4 tons per hectare. That is the grain. But in reality, we have at least 10 tons of biomass. In Australia, they are growing at around 10 tons only the grain, because they are doing a lot of irrigation, and they do it in a smart way. They have good plant species they are selecting, so they're getting very high production rate. And also in Egypt, they have very high. And then we can look at some less good examples. Like in Congo, they are staying with old-fashioned traditions when it comes to growth and so on, an old type of species, and then they are below 1 ton per hectare a year. So these huge differences is more than 10 times difference between principally the same production from one country to the other, depending on different reasons. Total production, 700 million tons roughly, and we had an average yield in China, 6.6 ton. In India, it was only like 45% average production compared to China. So if we just do the assumption that you could produce the same amount in India as you do in China per hectare, it would be enough food for 400 million people. It's big figures we're talking about just by making things a bit more efficient. When it comes to wheat, the biggest producer, China, here as well. And this is probably the most important crop globally here from a food perspective. And when we have, you remember, if we have a typical figure, in Sweden we have around, in the area where we are living, around 5 tons per hectare a year. But you're around 10 to 12 tons of biomass. What you're trying to do is to reduce the amount of cellulose, the straw, to get more grain, but in reality, perhaps we should do the opposite. It's better to focus on doing as much biomass as possible. The problem is that it varies quite a lot from one year to the other, but on the other hand, you can store it also. So here the straw, around 700 million tons per year, corresponding to, if you calculate this as a heating value, around 3,500 terawatt hours per year. We just take Europe. We're consuming 16,000 terawatt hours per year as primary energy in Europe. So this is 25% roughly of that. China has roughly the same figures. And they have these figures of straw production only in China. This was wheat, but if you take the different type of straws from wheat and rice and so on, in China they have around 4,000 terawatt hours of straw produced every year. That is not used very efficiently. Corn, maize, In the US, it's the most important crop in the US. And the interesting thing is in the US, you know what it's used for? Mostly? Ethanol production. And why do you produce ethanol in the US? You have a lot of farmers in the Midwest. And these farmers would not survive if they were not allowed to sell this corn to the ethanol production, I would say. So it's a very much like subsidizing farmers that are not having, because if they were going to sell this on the market as food, it's too much. So they're using, US is, aside of Brazil, the biggest producer of ethanol. But it's not done from an environmental perspective, but from like a commercial aspect to feed these farmers with something, but also to reduce the dependency of the Mideast. So it's political in very many ways, but from different angles than we usually have it in Europe. And this, of course, is the reason why they're using cheap coal to distillations and things like that, because the subsidy is on the ethanol and not on the environmental aspects. If you look at these CMIs, one good thing is that when you're coming close to harvesting, they are starting producing an antibiotic substance that is keeping track on those who are trying to kill them or so on. So, and I think this is quite interesting. And what you have been doing is also in this way, you're doing what you call the GMO, genetically modified things, where you're trying to get them less sensitive to drought, less sensitive to frost and things like that. And in Europe, we have quite a big skepticism to this genetic modification. In the US, Canada, I don't think. And I think sometimes we are a bit too sensitive in Europe in this sense, because in reality what you're doing is similar type thing what nature is normally doing, but it takes a bit longer. What we can see is it's quite a lot of production per hectare. Sugarcane, I was talking about Brazil here and ethanol production, and Brazil is producing a lot of ethanol, and coming back to that later on. But if we look at the production in billions of tons, the sugarcane is the highest producer, but not as a food substance, but it's much more utilized for other purposes than food. Cassava, we're talking about Africa, and when it comes to Africa, this is probably the most important crop in Africa south of Sahara. And the cassava is having a very good like a system that can handle a drought and so on very well. So you're taking the rots and they can sustain also very heavy droughts. So they are very resistant to many difficulties in that way. It's also a good feedstock for ethanol production, and the ethanol, of course, could be used in the biorefinery, and we could use it for other type of chemicals, and we can also use production of other type of species from the same type of material. One thing we perhaps don't think too much about is animals, and especially insects, as we don't eat very much insects in Northern Europe, at least. But if you come around the world, it's roughly 1,400 species that are utilized, mostly in Africa, Asia, and South America. And if you look at the next line, I think that is quite interesting. If you want to produce 1 kilogram of beef, you need principally 10 kilogram of fodder. But if you want to produce 10 kilogram of insects, you're getting, for these 10 kilogram of fodder, you're getting 9 kilogram of insects out, or insect protein. So this is a food that I think will come up a lot. And of course, insects can be a lot of different type of things. And perhaps if we don't want to eat it ourselves, we can perhaps, instead of having the soybean, perhaps we could use it for our animals and so on as a feedstock. And this is very nice things. I took it to market here. You recognize this? It's a lot of nice things. It's different type of bugs, and it's beetles, and you have scorpions. So you can eat a lot of very nice things, and then you just eat it straight off. So other products. We have a guy called Kukkonen in California who has been working on making guy and kingsgrass farms. And in this case, its growth rates he has a farm in China that he's running where you have a production of 100 tons of dry solids per hectare a year. Think about that, 100 tons. It's enormous amount. So what you do in this case is we're looking at in Ghana to put up these type of plants, and then you just put the biogas facility or the biorefinery in the center, and you have enough production so you don't need to have a long distance transportation. And it's just growing around you. So I think this is very interesting, and you can use marginal land as long as you have water, but it needs water. Without irrigation it will not be so high production. And this is a plant we have with the similar type of thing, switchgrass here in close to our city, Västerås here, and the farmer, he is using this to produce pellets that we're using then for combustion and burning. And switchgrass is a good feedstock for bioethanol production, and we can use it for biorefineries and so on. And if you look at, we did some calculations on this, and we could reduce the greenhouse gases with up to 94% compared to if we're running gasoline. And what you perhaps don't think about is that if you're running gasoline, it takes roughly 25% extra to take it up and refine it and do all these type of things, transportation and so on. If you're doing ethanol or some other type of chemicals and so on, you have some addition of fuels and so on, but you could of course use ethanol or biogas or something like that, and then you can take the greenhouse gas emissions down very dramatically, and then you have a very high impact on this. Algae is another thing. At our university we are looking quite a lot on microalgae in the lake Mälardalen. Our university is called Mälardalen University, which means the valley of the lake Mälardalen. And there we have a lot of different type of species of algae that we are trying to grow and use as a combination of production of biomass, but also as a substrate that we're using. When we have it as a substrate for the biogas production, we're also using it for wastewater treatment. The EU directives are giving very strong demands on release of nitrogen and phosphate. And we've seen that we can take it down dramatically with the algae. They're very efficient to take up also very small amounts. So I would guess that we will see algae farms in connection with wastewater treatment plants, because it would be the easiest way of handling the new directives from the EU concerning emissions from wastewater treatment and so on. We have also macroalgae, which is growing in huge amounts in California and also in the Faroe Island. We had a discussion here with the Ocean Rainforest, if you've heard about that. This company in the Faroe Island, and they have like 15 terawatt hours of kelp that they can harvest. And this is what kelp is looking like when it comes up. It's not huge productions commercially today, but it's quite important in some places in Asia and some other places. And this is what we're looking at in Eskilstuna, our neighboring city, to grow algae for combined wastewater treatment and biomass production, and then utilize the residues in the nearby wastewater treatment biogas production facility. Hybrid poplar is another type of thing where we can see trees are normally growing relatively slowly. You have a production perhaps of 3 tons per hectare a year, typically in northern Scandinavia and so on here. But if you go to hybrid poplar, you will be perhaps up to 5-10 times higher production rate. And you will not replace everything, but if you take a certain portion of our forests, I think this will be very interesting in the future. Another thing is corn. Some of you have heard about corn probably. It's like a mushroom, but it's growing in reactors. And it's a guy in England who invented this and now producing this. And they have building up a whole community around this corn with good. You can buy the corn in the shops, and then you can use it as a replacement for meat. And it's like chicken. When you buy it, it tastes like chicken. It's a consistency like chicken, and the pieces are looking like chicken, but it's not chicken. What you get is you have to treat it a bit, but you're principally using starch as the fuel or the input and some nitrogen and phosphate. What you get is a lot of RNA that you have to destroy, heat treatment and so on, but otherwise it's quite feasible. If you come to China, we can see we have a huge amount of biogas production. And these are some figures that we have around 22 million small-scale biogas plants producing a huge amount of biogas here. And quite a few also medium and large-scale plants exist. And there is a prediction that 2020, the production of biogas should be around 44 billion cubic meters per year. And 2030, 80 billion. And we see that very often in China, these plans are also followed when you have the huge. And then we can compare these 80 billion with our Växtkraft project that is producing 4 million. So it's huge scales. And we have Changguan Group in Henan province, where Yu Li is representing here, up here in the audience. So we have a cooperation between our university and a Swedish company called SEKAB, Swedish Ethanol Conversion Company, and Changguan Group. And they have a huge biorefinery plant. So I know that Elias is very interested in biorefineries and so on, and they have a full-scale biorefinery. It's like 1 times 1 kilometer area where you have production of ethanol, 500,000 tons. In this single plant, you have 250,000 cubic meters reactor volume for biogas. You're producing 150 million cubic meters of biogas per year when it's up and running. And this is from the ethanol production. Then they have a big factory where they are producing plastic polymer things, polyethylene terephthalate. They are producing acetic acid, acetone, a lot of products where they're using the ethanol as the basis and doing it. So it's very similar, but they have so far been using wheat, primarily in corn, the grain. In this project that we're working with now, it's a pilot plant, 10,000 cubic meter ethanol per year, and a biogas reactor, but only using straw as a feedstock, and try to see how to do that. So there is a lot of things going on, and this is like a key plant in China. There's not a lot of them, but it's to show and demonstrate in full scale that this is possible. And this is from the plant, and we have the Swedish guys in the middle are from SEKAB, and the other ones from China. And we have Chen Dahong here. She was staying for half a year at our department in 2009, I think it was, giving the input to our cooperation. Through her, she's working for the authorities in the Henan province. So responsible for all the demonstration projects in Henan province. And Henan province probably don't tell you anything, but it's 98 million people in the Henan province. So it's like Sweden and Finland and Denmark and Germany together. We have a lot of cassava and sweet potato. I think I skipped some of these pictures and going to the US. We have a lot of production of straw and other type of things. I made some calculations here that we have the total production of biomass is in the range of this, which is very much more than the total demand of energy in the United States. This one I wanted to go to, ethanol production in Brazil. If you look at today, you have the ethanol that is produced from sugarcane is, you can see here, 1% of the arable land area is used, and it's replacing 30% of fossil fuels. So if we increase this to 3% of the arable land, then we produce and replace all the oil in Brazil, or the fuel for the vehicles. So this is And we have roughly 7.5% of the available arable land is not used very intensively in Brazil today. So it's huge amount that is here. This, I think, is very interesting, that the ethanol production, the cost is roughly $0.25 per liter. And the oil that is produced by Petrobras is in this range. So the oil companies in Brazil is trying to get subsidies because they can't compete with ethanol production from a commercial point of view. So they are pushing the government very strongly to increase the subsidies to oil production. Because, and you've heard about, there was an election in Brazil a few days ago, and the biggest obstacle for the re-election of the president was the corruption in this oil company that is now trying to get the subsidies. They have been paying a lot of money to politicians to get subsidies on oil production because they see the ethanol is more economical. And I think this is something we should keep in mind. It's a lot of discussions about subsidies to renewable energy, but in reality, you have 5 times more subsidies to fossil fuels than you have to renewables in the world globally. You have roughly $75 billion per year to renewables, but you have $450 billion per year in subsidies to oil and those fossil fuels. When shall I stop? 5 minutes, okay. Of course, I just take some examples of conversion. This is from our neighboring city. Guys are doing a very easy like production of gasification from wood chips. And this is a small reactor where we are producing then electricity. We have a gasifier, automated like a fixed bed reactor, and it's dragging up the gas and running it in an engine and producing electricity. And it's self-sustained. You don't need very much control, except for that you're controlling the power output from this unit. Waste is another source. This is with the waste combustion plant we have in Västerås. We're producing roughly 150-200 megawatt thermal per year, where we're also seeing the possibility. We have a sorting first, where we are then recycling a lot of other things like metals and glass and so on. Hope to get also plastics out. And then the rest we're combusting and could also be gasifying. This is from Söderhamn, where we have a solid phase reactor, where they are taking the household waste. And the reactor is, you're pumping water liquid through this. It's a bit similar to our other pilot test in ABOWE, but in this case, you're only pumping the liquid. And in this case, in our reactor, the pilot, we had actually the solids flowing through the reactor, so it's a different principle. Pulp and paper industry is a huge user of biomass, and what we cannot produce in our biorefineries when it comes to the biological processes. This is, of course, where we have the big potential. This is from Korsnäs in Gävle that we are working a lot with on optimization of the production and so on. But what you can see is a bleach plant, you have the combustion of power, and you have the digesters just there, and they are producing a lot of chemicals already. And we're working with a company called Borregaard, and they are, it's a pulp and paper company principally, but they don't produce any fiber anymore. But they have this textiles. So they have kind of fibers, but they dissolve it and use it for clothes. They're using ethanol, they're producing vanilla, they are producing like tensides, using the lignin. Instead of burning the lignin, they're using it for other purposes, like tensides and chemical source and so on. And you have a lot of potentials. You have gasification and so on. We're looking a lot on how to utilize different type of substances, and then you get syngas that you can use for production of different type of chemicals. So what we can see is that it's not only one method. There will be a number of methods depending on the substrate and the situation, if it's a large scale or small scale. But there are a number of technologies that are coming up, and many of them are already useful, and that you could use, like these type of things, of course. The company, this one is quite profitable. They are producing the board for Tetra Pak. You know, that when you're drinking milk and juice and so on. The money they are generating has been used to produce. Have you seen that? There's a magazine called Metro that you see all over the world today. This company has been funding that. You have TV3, 5, and 8 in Sweden. They have financed starting that. They have the Tele2. It's financed by the earnings from this company. So they're producing a lot of money that is used into the IT. But of course, you could utilize this also to produce a lot of chemicals and so on. So these are the type of things we can see as when we say the next generation, what we call it, biomass industrial revolution, I think Elias was calling it. And it's just to show that we have a lot of potentials on this. And I show a book that quite a few of us have been participating in writing 2 books. It's one of the books is called Biomass and as Energy Source, Resources to Applications. I was the editor, and we have Elias, and we have Ari, and we have a lot of others here have been participating in writing this. We have another book on volume number 4 that is on biomass conversion, about different technologies. So if you want to read about those, where we try to cover the last things, you can read in these books also. I think I stopped there. Any quick question? Or what do you say? Yeah.